This is Joan with the Joan Jerkovich Show at 910 KINA Salina, bringing you innovative talk radio that surprises, entertains, and sometimes informs you. We have an interesting show today because we have two addiction specialists on today. We're going to be talking about addictions because as we go into the new year, a lot of times people want to be thinking about making these changes. Sometimes family situations that they find themselves in over the holiday have prompted things. Maybe families have sort of confronted addictions. So it's a good time to kind of talk about this. And if you yourself, and most of us maybe have been affected in some way by addiction, either with a family member, maybe someone we're in relationship with, maybe a coworker, if you haven't, we've certainly all heard about the celebrity addictions with actors, musicians, and all of these things can, as we've heard with Michael Jackson and Amy Winehouse, most recently in the news, addictions can have very tragic consequences. So I want to welcome again our first specialist, Matthew Weller. Welcome.
Thank you, Joan. I appreciate your offer. You're asking me to be here.
Yes, yes. And, you know, we had a little bit of talk here on video before we came up here on the broadcast that talks about your long background. And tell me about your credentialing and how long you've been working in this specialty.
Well, I've worked in an agency in the field since 1974, and I've seen tremendous changes in credentials over that period of time. Originally, agencies provided services, and it was up to the agency to hire people that they thought could provide the service. And since that time, it's been upgraded a notch at a time, requiring more and more training and education, to where now it's a field that's licensed. You cannot practice without the license, and to get the license, you have to meet some very strict requirements. Education, a practicum, certain number of hours that you're supervised in providing services. So it's a much different field than it was back in 1974.
It sounds like it's changed so much, because you were even saying, you know, as we were visiting here, about how companies just say, well, you'd be a good one to help with this, or maybe you've had this in your family or something, so go with it. When did the licensing take place? It seems fairly recent.
Well, licensing just started this summer.
This summer.
But back in the 90s when they started establishing criteria for being a counselor. If you were coming into the field new, you could grandfather in if you've been doing that for a while. But if you were coming into the field new, you needed a certain number of hours of education and psychopharmacology and the addiction field related issues. And that went from 18 for a few years up to 27, and now it's a bachelor's degree.
So you're quite qualified, and tell me then, Matthew, what sort of addictions do you work with?
Well, most of our presenting addictions are marijuana, cocaine, meth. Those are probably the top three illegal drugs. Alcohol, of course, is still around and causes problems.
So I'm surprised you didn't name alcohol as one of the top ones. That's the one I would think of as most common. Is that not the most common one that you see coming in for treatment?
Well, like most, well, how do I explain? Like most people who abuse alcohol or drugs, they only seek treatment when there's a problem with that drug use, and that population changes from time to time. Right now, I don't think I have anybody in the group that has a DUI. Other times, half the group may have had DUIs. It just depends on the courts and what's happened. And of course, they may be in another group other than mine. The common denominator is that something happens to interrupt that progression of alcohol or drug use. And they might get a DUI and be put on probation and be ordered to go to treatment. They might have a possession charge and be put on probation again and be ordered to go to treatment. So sometimes it's companies sending people, truck drivers with dirty UAs or breath tests. Sometimes it's families that confront people. Could be any of a number of things causing a minor crisis that forces somebody to look at their use of that chemical, and while they may not initially say that it's a problem, because it has been working up to that point, over a period of time, they usually start to see that, well, yeah, maybe I did do this and maybe I did do that. Maybe it would have been better if I hadn't done those things, but I only did those because I was drinking or using, and then it starts to connect with them that their use of alcohol or drugs is causing their problems.
So is this sort of a progressive disease? Do you see it as progressive, where maybe it started out maybe drinking or partying too much, and it just started to get more and more frequent and more of a problem in their personal or work lives or whatever?
Yeah, nobody starts off drinking or drugging saying, I want to be an alcoholic or a drug addict. You know, nobody says I want to be in jail, even though I'm told it's a very nice jail. Nobody wants to be in trouble with...
Don't say that. We wouldn't think it's a horrible place.
Nobody wants the consequences that come from problems with use, but everybody starts out innocently. A drink takes the edge off a bad day. Everybody knows that. If you go to a party, it's more fun if you drink. The problem comes if you keep drinking after the party, or you drink too much at the party, or you start your own parties because there's no excuse to drink, and that happens over a period of time. A lot of people get hooked on drugs because they very innocently start them, even though they're illegal drugs. They might use meth to stay awake on a third shift job, because during the day they had to take care of kids, or they had problems at school, or something was going on, so it was a one-time use that started them. And when they got in the same situation, they used again and again, and it kind of became a habit. I've known truck drivers that used meth when they came home to be able to get everything done, because they were gone out on the road 5 days and they had 2 days to do all the household chores.
Well, and I've heard of people who become addicted to illegal pain medication after surgery. You've seen that as well?
Sure, yeah. Painkillers, the synthetic opiates are very addictive, and it's very easy to get hooked on them. I mean,
so what is your philosophy? What is your understanding of how and why someone gets addicted? Because, you know, we have to bring into this what we think of, is this actually a disease process?
You know, the disease label has been around for a while, and there seems to be evidence for it, but I'm not a doctor. I can't say for sure. I didn't do the research. I know that it certainly makes sense from a layman's point of view, but when I work with people, I seem to have more success without a label on that person, because they don't want to be labeled an alcoholic or addict by somebody else. But what they can see is that they are having problems from their use, and they can address that. Later on, they may use that label to help them understand that they can't drink without having problems, or they can't use without having problems. But initially, that's not something that people like to hear, that they have a disease, because here in America, we believe in willpower. You know, you don't have, you know, there's still the stigma for mental health problems. You can go to the doctor for anything, but if you go to a mental health professional, you know, what's wrong with you? You know, now we are overcoming that. You know, it's taken time, but we still have some of that left over with alcohol and drug use. I mean, who was it that said just say no to drugs? You know, the president's wife years ago. Absolutely no understanding of how that develops.
Or how for some people that is an incredibly challenging thing to do because of body chemistry or whatever, that maybe even isn't, like you were saying, it's not just willpower, but we like to think of the willpower. You're really getting me to wrap my head around something that's sort of novel, because it sounds to me like a lot of your clients that come to you don't want to be stigmatized, don't want to be labeled, but they can take it and then say, well, if I do this, this bad consequence happens to me. And you found that to be more effective.
Yes.
And more palatable to the people that come to you and try to do that. We're talking about substance abuse a lot, but let me get into what I would say, you know, are possibilities for some of our listeners that have other types of addiction. What about gambling addiction, or is there even such a thing as a sex addiction? Because I think there's been a lot of cheaters that like to use that a little flippantly.
Well, you know, I was trained in gambling, and the fascinating thing about it is that it has the same dynamics as a chemically based addiction. And the similarity is the chemistry in the brain. And if you look at what's happening in the brain, anything can be an addiction. if you're using it to escape from problems, to feel good temporarily, and that becomes more important than living your life responsibly, you know, then it opens the field wide open to anything can be an addiction. Now, obviously, we've identified gambling, very similar dynamics, documented, studied. Sex seems to be the same way. Work has been documented the same way, long hours at work. What we're looking at is the feel good that comes from any kind of behavior that saves you from something you don't want to do. You know.
Well, that's an important criteria. You know, tell us more about that, because, you know, I mean, I can, you know, jokingly say I have an addiction to reality television. It's extremely relaxing to me in a sense that it's my drug of choice. But then I don't have it affecting my work habits. I don't have it affecting my relationships. So where do we know that we're moving from something we like to do and can be a healthy coping mechanism or relaxation modality to an addiction? Well, what's the cutoff? What's that trigger?
And you identified it. It's whether it's causing problems for you. If you're not feeding your kids because reality TV is on and that's your show, you know, and you didn't make arrangements before, and the kids are crying, and you know afterwards it's you have to call your neighbor or best friend to talk about what happened, and can you believe that she said that.
So it doesn't count if I just ignore a cell phone call. That's not really tragic. Okay. Yeah. So, but if you're, really, if it's affecting the responsibilities in your life, yes. Or I would assume then any of those types of behaviors could also be the people you're in relationship with saying, hey, pay attention to me, turn the football off. I guess we could even have an addiction to sports things, or I've known people who are addicted to video games, computers. So it's all kind of the same process.
Yeah, and video games are one of those things that is immediately reinforcing, feels good, and they end up putting a lot of time and money into it. They stay up late playing the game, they oversleep, lose their job, and that's kind of good because then they can play video games more, not thinking about what are the long-term consequences of not having money coming in. That would be more in the addiction field than in the recreational area.
Absolutely. Well, that's something that's going to be good to take a break on. I think we have obviously so much more we can talk with here with Matthew Weller, our addiction specialist. I want you to be sure and stay tuned. We have a second specialist coming on. This is the Joan Jerkovich Show, and be sure to go to my website, joanjerkovich.com, for video outtakes, podcasting, and you can even link us to iTunes and my blogs. This is the Joan Jerkovich Show on 910 KINA Salina. Ben, I think I stopped just a tiny bit early, didn't I?
Yeah, you stopped a minute early,
but we'll shoot for round 8 if we go a little over the next one.
Next round 8.
Yeah. Good stuff. I really enjoy talking to you. I mean, I just think what we've hit on so far has been, don't you think, Ben?
It sounds good to me. I think this next segment, if you guys jump a little more in depth in some of it, because you guys are
I know, so much of it with one guest. And
it's hard with the time limit and stuff.
I know. Is there anything in particular, Matthew, you think we should hit on that is something that, you're the specialist. What do people want to hear? What do they need to hear? What are going to get them the help they need?
I think maybe the thing to do is to talk about people. You in your intro you talked about people who have addiction problems in the family or abuse problems, and friends, whoever, and maybe talking about how to address that a little.
I had one of those as one of my questions. I think that's really a good thing. So in other words, how do the people that are watching this addict and address that and confront it, maybe, or however you want to say it, address it?
It's very difficult because they're going to argue. It's like, get off my case. I wouldn't be drinking if you weren't on my case all the time. I wouldn't do drugs if you weren't on this pressure.
I know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
it's your fault. You drove me to drink.